大家好，我係 Felix，
我係 Ernest，
我係 Helen，
我哋係 Rojack。好啦，歡迎大家嚟到咧幾首歌之國際留聲機嘅第6集啦，冇錯係第6集嘅，但係咧以下呢一段咧就係 Ernest 逼我講嘅，咁咧你哋係冇睇漏第5集嘅。因為咧呢2個禮拜嘅工作關係咧，咁所以我就處於呢個瀕死嘅狀態，咁啊所以未有時間剪片咧。咁我哋採取嘅制度不嬲都係咧邊個講咧就邊個剪，咁所以咧Ernest 咧今集講咧就會早過我出街嘅，咁亦都好反映到香港政府就係養呢啲咁嘅懶人啦。
連呢一句説話都係我逼佢講㗎。好啦，咁其實咧我過去幾個禮拜都處於瀕死狀態嘅，如果唔係嘅話咧，一定捱義氣幫你剪嘅，
係啦，
係咪啊？係啊，
唔緊要，係啦。咁今日我哋有位新主持喎。
Hello， 大家好，我係 Helen。
好，俾啲掌聲。好。咁啊好啦，咁我哋今日入正題啦。OK。上次我哋講咗一個唔存在嘅超級大國啦，今日講一個好似係存在嘅超級大國。
係啦，上一集我哋講蘇聯啦嚇，咁啊今一集我哋講邊個超級大國咧？大家估中就冇獎嘅，唔好意思。咁但係咧就為咗我仍然可以攞到入美國嘅簽證咧，我哋今一次講呢一個美國咧，雖然唔係講佢嘅威水史，而係講佢最兜踎嘅時期嘅歷史啦。但係咧，我哋會着力去講咧，美國喺70、80年代嗰陣時最兜踎嘅時期咧，如何喺呢個重災區紐約嘅頹垣敗瓦之中咧，發生一場社會基層文化嘅重生喎。
係啊，如何咧？
但係唔係喎，其實紐約對於好多香港人嚟講係一個 glamorous、非常 shiny、輝煌嘅一個城市，但係喺佢口中咧就講到好似成個重災區咁。好恐怖！究竟係點咧？
係啊，嗱，大部分香港人想像嘅紐約都係啲摩天大樓林立啦、居水馬龍啦，大家一齊去聽呢個係啦。Big Apple 啦 ，Everyone wants to take a bite 啫嘛，咁啊係嘛，咁所以咧就係呢一個咁樣嘅人聽百老匯歌劇嘅一個咁樣嘅地方啦嚇。但係其實咧，我哋睇大部分嘅呢啲咁樣嘅對紐約嘅形容咧，譬如呢隻歌啦，1982年嗰陣時，呢個歌手 Joe Jackson 嘅呢隻 Stepping Out 咧，就都可以反映大家咧對紐約嘅呢個遐想嘅喎。其實咧呢種遐想只不過係一種遐想嚟嘅啫，係啦。我而家想俾大家睇下70、80年代紐約真實嘅面貌啦。好，咁啊先睇一套咧71年嘅電影嘅片段咯。係，咁呢套電影咧就係講咧一個黑人嘅偵探咧，就同意大利嘅黑幫去搏鬥。咁咧就係拯救一個咧係被綁架咗嘅另一個黑幫首領嘅女。係，咁咧呢個亦都聯繫到咧我即將講嘅呢一個治安惡化嘅問題嘅。咁啊呢個音樂嘅創作人 Isaac Hayes 啊，佢講話嘅方式咧，同埋即將講到嘅 rap 亦都有相當大嘅關係。
Timepiece, brother. Goodbye.
Who's the black private dick that's a sex machine to all the chicks?
Shaft!
Damn right. Who is the man that would risk his neck for his brother, man?
Shaft!
Can you dig it? Who's the cat that won't cop out when there's danger all about?
Shaft!
Right on. You say this cat is a bad mother.
Shut your mouth.
I'm talking about Shaft.
Then we can dig it.
He's a complicated man, but no one understands him but his woman.
John Shaft.
Hey, what's happening, Marty?
Same old sixes and sevens, Shaft. Two guys looking for you. Like,
咁好啦，我而家再睇下呢個80年代初嘅紐約啦。咁啊，背景音樂咧就係另一個英國嘅音樂人啦嚇。上次我哋介紹過嘅 Freeze 嘅主音 John Rocker 所 produce 嘅一隻 hip hop 歌叫 Englishman in New York， 就唔係 Sting 嗰一隻喎。咁咧畫面上所見到咧就係紐約嘅曼克頓以北嘅呢一個南布洛克斯區，即係 South Bronx 啊。咁當時成個區以及係哈林咧，同埋呢一個布洛克林區嘅部分嘅地區啦，因為火災等等嘅緣故咧，有部分嘅分區咧係喪失咗90%以上嘅建築嘅
90%以上
，90%，
即係冇晒噶咯喎，
差唔多冇噶啦。嗱，俾一個例子你啦，呢個布朗克斯人口普查第2區咧，喺1970年嗰陣時有830幾座嘅建築嘅，
係
80年嗰陣時有幾多座？大家估下啦。
50、
再少啲
30咯，
再少啲，
20、
唔係
再少啲
佢話10啊，佢話10%啊，
10%。
係839乘10%，8.3度。
9座，冇錯啦，係啦。嗱，所以咧呢一個咁樣嘅紐約當時咧，其實係有60萬人流離失所嘅，
係
經濟活動減少咗20%，人均收入減少咗35%。 咁咧喺當時嚟講咧，好多人咧甚至將呢個 South Bronx 咧係形容為咧戰後俾人炸平咗嘅呢一個德國嘅啲城市咁樣添。
咁真係好誇張。
好誇張，因為基本上落到去下邊咧係頹垣敗瓦一片嘅。咁啊，但係我哋今一集講嘅 hip hop 咧，就係喺 South Bronx 區嘅誕生。
對於紐約有咁唔同嘅一個印象咧？
嗱，其實因為紐約咧，嗱雖然作為內戰裏邊嘅北方嘅州份嘅城市啦嚇，紐約早喺1827年就廢除咗奴隸制啦嚇，但係其實咧同大部分嘅美國城市一樣咧，都係存在呢個地域上高嘅種族隔離嘅喎。咁大家睇下呢張紐約嘅地圖啦嚇，就可以見到咧，圖中心就係呢個曼克頓啦嚇，就係中心嘅商業區啦嚇。曼克頓以北嘅地方咧，就係呢個傳統嘅黑人區，即係哈林區。咁啊，往東咧過咗河咧，就另外一個黑人區就布魯克林啦。同埋呢個哈林以北咧，就係布魯克斯區啦。咁傳統上咧，布魯克斯區係一個西歐移民嘅區嚟嘅喎。咁但係咧喺二戰之前咧，由於蘇聯嘅建立啦，同埋納粹德國嘅呢個迫害啦嚇，咁啊紐約嚟咗好多呢個東歐嘅呢個猶太人。咁啊，呢啲人啊逐步取代咗布魯克斯區嘅啲西歐嘅白人咯喎。咁佢哋之後咧，又俾一啲嘅黑人同埋拉丁美洲人咧，係取代喺50年代嗰陣時。咁尤其係嚟自美國嘅殖民地啦，呢個波多黎各嘅啲咁嘅人。咁啊，當時咧有啲家底嘅人，特別係啲白人嘅家庭啦嚇，就喺50年代嗰陣時，由於呢個紐約係實行呢一個嘅種族去隔離化，即係話咧學校裏邊咧唔同種族嘅人咧要融合啦，咁所以咧就要設法咧逃去呢個郊外咧去居住嘅喎，令到自己嘅子弟咧唔需要同啲黑人啊、拉丁美洲人咧係呢個混合呢個上堂嘅。咁所以紐約市咧就開始大量流失呢個稅收啦，財政狀況咧每況愈下。咁啊，一首好能夠代表呢種紐約嘅種族隔離嘅呢一個情況嘅歌咧，就係 Bobby Womack 嘅呢一首講區分曼克頓區同埋哈林區嘅第110街。
I was the third brother of five, doing whatever I had to do to survive. I'm not saying what I did was all right. Trying to break out of the ghetto was a day-to-day fight. Being down so long, getting up didn't cross my mind. But I knew there was a better way of life, and I was just trying to find. You don't know what you do until you put under pressure. Across 110th Street is a hell of a tester. Across 110th Street, pimps trying to catch a woman that's weak. Across 110th Street, pushers won't let the junkie go free. Across 110th Street, woman trying to catch a trick on the street. You baby, across 110th Street, you can find it all in the street.
咁啊，我哋翻返去之前個話題啦。咁啊，可唔可以解釋下咧？其實紐約呢一個狀況同埋70年代美國個兜踎係有啲咩關係咧？嚇
嗱，咁呢一個咧就係我今日呢一個節目嘅主要嘅話題啦嚇，所以就一次過答唔晒嘅，但我慢慢開始答啦。咁喺70年代嘅美國咧，其實係經歷咗好大嘅整個國家嘅挫折嘅。咁雖然美國總體情況比蘇聯好少少啦嚇，
越戰啊，因為
係啦，因為咧越戰嗰陣時，即係美國派軍隊去越南同埋呢個北越嘅共產軍隊交戰啦嚇，咁所以美國嘅國債迅速爬升咯喎，咁導致尼克遜總統喺71年嗰陣先宣布咧，就係呢一個美金同埋黃金要係脫鈎嘅，咁仍然無法呢個挽回越戰嘅頹勢喎，結果75年嗰陣時咧，西貢咧就俾北越嘅軍隊解放啦，咁咧就發生咗畫面上高而家見到嘅呢個南越嘅人員咧拼命爬上去直升機咧，要求咧係呢一個撤離西貢嘅呢個畫面，咁大家估唔到就係2021年嗰陣時咧，喺阿富汗又再發生多一次啦嚇，咁當時咧美國喺越戰嘅士兵咧平均年齡係19歲嘅
，19歲
，19歲，
咁係二戰嗰時先係20零歲，而家就變到19歲，即係低咗幾歲㗎咯喎？
係啊，好多人基本上係呢個高中讀完就俾人扯咗去呢個
高中未讀完，
高中未讀完係啦。咁自己嘅老豆啦嚇，往往就係二戰嗰陣時嘅老兵啦，所以係成個社會都係 PTSD 嘅。咁越戰嘅死傷人數好眾多啦嚇，甚至國內因為都有反戰運動咧，風起雲湧啦嚇。咁呢啲咁嘅美軍嘅士兵，往往咧翻到美國嘅機場嗰陣時咧，第一時間就係俾呢班咁嘅反戰人士辱罵嘅，而唔係英雄式嘅接待嘅。咁所以咧，尼克遜咧自己啦嚇，又冇幾耐咧，因為呢個水門事件要下台啦嚇，即係佢派人入去呢個民主黨嘅全國總部咧，就係偷竊文件咁樣樣啦。呢個事件咁就係呢個要下台。咁73年嗰陣時咧，呢個石油危機就爆發啦。咁美國物價開始猛烈就上升咯喎，失業就開始增長啦嚇。咁社會治安咧喺眾多呢啲上述因素嘅情況底下咧，咁就呢個迅速係惡化嘅。咁毒品問題又肆虐啦嚇。好多美國人咧，而家聞之色變嘅一啲連環殺手咧，都係70年代嗰陣時開始犯案嘅。
所以就係因為又打仗，
係啦，
跟住又多毒品，
係啦，
然後跟住尼克遜又要落台，
係啦，
加埋咧石油危機又爆發，然後跟住仲要失業，
係啦，
哇！咁真係
全美國係處於一個係非常之敗壞同埋迷失同埋一個挫折感好深重嘅一個咁樣嘅狀態裏邊嘅。咁徹底係喪失呢個鬥志啦嚇，咁好反映呢一個時期嘅呢種咁樣嘅迷失啦、治安敗壞嘅一首歌咧，就係 Gil Scott-Heron 嘅呢一首嘅講酗酒問題嘅 The Bottle， 咁74年嘅歌嚟嘅。
Uno, dos, tres, cuatro. You see that black boy over there running scared, his old man in a bottle. He done quit his 9 to 5, he drink full time, and now he's living in a bottle. See that black boy over there running scared, his old man got a problem, and it's a bad one. He ain't done pawned off damn near everything. His old woman waiting for a bottle. And don't you think it's a crime when time after time after time people in the bottom, there's people living in the bottom. Listen to me, see that sister, she was fine, she's finally thinking wine in the bottom. She told me, oh man, committed a crime, he's doing time, now she's hanging in the bottom. I seen her out there on the avenue all by herself. She sure need help from the bottom. I seen her, the man tried to help her. She cussed him out and hit him in the bottom. They turned to me, they asked me, kill Well, don't you think it's a crime? No way. And time after time after time, people in the bottom. There's people showing up in the bottom. Give another good example.
咁啊，頭先啱啱講咗越戰啦，亦都講咗啲反戰嘅運動啦，即係 no war make love 啊，係咪嗰啲啊？
係啊，
咁啊，當時我知好多白人，即係好多係咪 hippies 啊，都參與咗呢啲咁嘅反抗活動，但係黑人又點樣睇咧？呢啲係冇點樣嘅？
嗱，嗰陣時黑人咧都係有好多嘅迷失啦、疑惑啦咁樣樣。咁其實呢個黑人嘅文化嘅復興再迷失，再復興再迷失咧，呢個咁嘅過程咧，應該係話其實應該係話係一次世界大戰結束嘅時候，1910幾年嗰陣時開始。咁呢個史稱叫哈林復興嘅 Harlem Renaissance。咁咧喺一次大戰之前咧，紐約一直係接收呢啲咁嘅歐洲過嚟嘅移民嘅喎，咁充當啲廉價勞工嘅。咁但係喺大戰爆發同埋1917年呢一個嘅德國宣布無限制嘅潛艇作戰啦，即係任何嘅美國嘅船隻佢都會打沉嘅。咁喺呢個情況底下咧，歐洲嘅呢個移民潮咧就開始停止啦。咁取而代之嘅咧就係黑人嘅廉價勞工咯。咁佢哋就大量咁搬入去呢個紐約區。咁一戰當時咧，亦都有好多呢啲咁嘅黑人嘅士兵咧，係派咗去歐洲。咁第一次見過咧呢個歐洲嘅文明啦嚇，同埋呢一個俾白人咧視之為呢個平等嘅或者差唔多平等嘅一啲咁樣嘅，甚至解放者啦嚇。因為呢一個美國嘅士兵係派落去法國嗰度係打贏咗德軍嘅。咁所以咧呢個哈林咧就開始一場文化復興咯。咁一直延續到咧呢個30年代經濟大蕭條為止嘅。咁呢場運動之中咧，湧現咗好多嘅文化人啦，包括詩人啦、音樂家啦、劇作家等等啦。咁但係佢哋就並冇徹底係拋棄呢種白人嘅文化嘅。係。咁咧，
例如咧，
譬如話呢個當時咧黑人好中意就係要燙直自己啲頭髮。咁咪要着西裝啊咁樣，即係呢個同埋60、70年代嗰時相比啦嚇。60、70年代嗰時美國黑人好多係着呢一個嘅非洲式嘅民族衫啦嚇。著呢個或者係電呢個咁樣嘅 Afro 嘅頭啦嚇。20、30年代嘅呢個黑人復興嗰陣時咧，呢啲咁樣嘅黑人咧係想做白人嘅。咁呢一種咁樣嘅心態咧，就令到佢哋變咗做後來嘅一啲文化批判嘅一啲嘅批評嘅對象啦。咁美國黑人咧開始提出一種獨特嘅具有非洲色彩嘅文化咧，就係一個好複雜嘅過程嚟嘅。係。咁但係有幾個事件咧值得提。咁首先就係一個叫做伊斯蘭民族嘅一個宗教團體 Nation of Islam。OK。咁呢個同正統伊斯蘭教其實關係就唔係好大嘅啫。咁根據一啲資料顯示咧，就係呢個團體喺30年嗰陣時咧，就喺底特律嗰陣時係由一個假扮阿拉伯人嘅白人咧所創立嘅，即係遊客自己咁啊。我唔知具體點樣啦，但係佢有辦法即係 convincing 啦嚇。咁然之後咧就好快就受到呢種咁樣嘅尋找新嘅文化認同感嘅黑人咧所係追捧咯。咁但係呢個白人喺3、4年嗰陣先突然間人間蒸發咗。其實我唔明點解呢個人要假扮。咁因為當時咧，其實咧美國係有一啲嘅伊斯蘭嘅團體嘅。咁當然呢啲伊斯蘭團體嘅教義同埋真正嘅遜尼派或者什葉派係有啲分別啦。咁呢個白人嘅身份係點樣咧？有唔同嘅講法嘅。有人話咧佢就係呢啲咁嘅早期嘅一戰嗰陣時成立嘅伊斯蘭團體嘅一個成員啦嚇。有人話佢係一個逃犯啦。有人話佢係各種各樣嘅身份啊，咁基本上冇咩定論嘅，因為佢即係基本上連屍都揾唔翻啊呢個人。咁所以咧就係呢個人咧，佢最重要一樣嘢就係佢揀咗一個叫 Elijah Muhammad 嘅人咧，就做佢嘅徒弟啊。咁佢喺人間蒸發咗之後咧，就由呢個人咧就係承繼咗呢個 Nation of Islam 嘅呢個咁嘅團體嘅領導權啦。咁呢個教派嘅教義咧，簡單嚟講咧就好怪雞嘅，就係咧佢就話造物主咧阿拉咧。係個黑人嚟嘅喎，咁呢個阿拉咧係一代傳一代嘅，代代都係黑人嚟嘅。咁至於白人係咩人咧？白人就6000年前一個黑人嘅科學家叫 Yakub， 咁佢就利用咧呢個選擇性培育咧創出嚟嘅魔鬼嚟嘅。 咁於是耶穌咧就被派往去教化呢啲嘅白人咧，令到佢哋變做 civilized 嘅人。咁而佢嘅出現咧係為咗預兆咧呢個2000幾年之後咧，阿拉將會以 Elijah Muhammad 嘅呢個身份咧，但係重新返回地球嘅。
返回地球。
係啦。咁
幾多人信咧呢樣嘢嗰陣時？
哇！全盛時期真係好多數以萬計添。咁啊呢個阿拉咧係只係允許白人統治地球6000年嘅啫。咁所以咧結束嘅時間咧就快到㗎啦。咁而1914年嘅呢個世界大戰爆發咧，就係、是、呢個白人霸權結束嘅呢個咁嘅時期啦。咁樣
都幾 make sense 啊！
都幾 make sense 啊！
其實都幾 make sense。
係啊，因為咧，即係第一樣嘢就係咧呢個咁樣嘅1914年咧，係被歷史學家視為呢個歐洲殖民主義霸權結束嘅呢個關鍵嘅日子嚟嘅。
啱啊。
係啦，咁啊基本上由1914年開始，歐洲嘅呢啲咁嘅大帝國咧就開始呢一個嘅呢個衰落啦嚇。跟住美國開始上升啦嚇。咁啊此其一。咁啊第二咧就係哲學上高嚟講咧，如果話白人咧係6000年前嘅黑人科學家嘅創造，但係最後反過嚟咧係主宰咗黑人嘅命運嘅話咧，就好符合呢個哲學同民族學上高一個嘅 notion 啦，就係一個好舊嘅一個主題。咁咧就係話咧，譬如話一個人啦嚇，創造咗啲機械人之後咧，個機械人反過嚟打死咗自己啦，即係好似叫哥倫啦呢個猶太嘅呢個咁樣嘅古仔嚟嘅。咁咧所以咧，如果話白人係我創造出嚟嘅，而結束白人咧係我嘅呢一個使命嘅話咧，咁就好 make sense 啦。咁所以咧，呢個50年代之後咧伊斯蘭民族咧就得到一批嘅名人嘅支持啦，包括邊個咧？拳王阿里啦，咁啊包括當時嘅一個民權嘅領袖叫做 Malcolm X 啊，咁啊當時咧 Elijah Muhammad 嘅助手就係呢個 Malcolm X 啊，咁佢亦都係伊斯蘭民族嘅全國總代表嚟嘅，咁啊佢將自己個姓氏咧改咗做 X 啊，由 Little改咗做 X 啊。點解咧？就係話佢係呢個黑人被奴役之前咧，嗰個姓氏咧佢已經冇辦法揾得翻。咁喺揾得翻之前咧嘅暫代咧就係將呢個 Little 改翻做 X 咁樣樣。未知數係啦。咁所以咧呢一個佢提出咧就係話白人嘅基因咧係相較黑人嚟講咧係呢一個劣質嘅。咁所以咧黑人嘅鬥爭咧必定係會勝出嘅。咁為咗維權咧為咗維護自己嘅生存權啊、就業權啊等等啦必須利用咧一切必須嘅手段。
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.
咁呢個伊斯蘭民族嘅鬥爭目標咧，就喺美國嘅南部咧，建立一個過渡性嘅黑人國家。
咩叫過渡性？
咩叫過渡性黑人國家咧？就係話咧，將所有嘅黑人咧，最終咧係要送翻去呢個非洲嘅。
非洲。咁
喺送到翻去非洲之前啦咁有幾多100萬人啦咁就喺美國南部咧就劃出一個區出嚟，咁就係建立一個黑人國家咁樣樣。
哦，但係佢哋有冇同非洲嗰啲有聯絡？
有㗎，佢同阿爾及利亞係有聯絡嘅。咁當時有好多呢啲咁樣嘅回教嘅，
即係其實佢哋非洲嗰邊咧，即係佢哋想翻去，但係非洲嗰邊都 welcome 佢哋翻去嘅。
當時有一啲準備功夫，未有正式嘅表態。咁當時點解佢哋會想咁做咧？因為咧非洲好多國家啱開始就獨立啦，咁所以就有呢個咁嘅條件去做。
即係50幾年嗰陣時。
50幾年嗰陣時係啦。咁所以咧。Malcolm X 咧喺國際上去建立分部喎，譬如話我哋上次講到英國嘅呢一個有一個黑人嘅領袖叫 Michael de Freitas 啦，咁咧呢個就係英國嘅分部主管嚟嘅，咁佢嘅自己個
呢個伊斯蘭民族
係啦，咁佢嘅呢一個行動嘅 code name 咧就係呢一個 Michael X， 因為有一次咧 Malcolm X 嚟到倫敦嗰陣時咧，就有個旅館嘅老闆就以為佢哋兩個兩兄弟嚟嘅。咁於是就將 Michael 個名就寫咗 X 咁樣樣，咁所以自此之後佢就改咗自己名做 Michael X 啊咁樣樣。係啦，咁我哋就唔知道啦呢個 Malcolm X 究竟係對於頭先講嗰啲咁荒謬嗰啲咁樣嘅教義咧，係究竟係真係相信定係假戲真做啦？咁但係公認嘅事實就係咩？就係 Malcolm X 喺64年嗰陣時去咗麥加去朝聖喎。咁咧佢就朝聖完之後翻到嚟咧， 先係公開批評呢個伊斯蘭民族嘅教義係走樣嘅。咁啊並且咧佢係發現咗一樣嘢叫做咩？叫做白人嘅伊斯蘭教徒。
白人伊斯蘭
係啦，並且即係好南斯拉夫嗰啲啦。
明係。
咁啊並且咧呢啲咁樣嘅白人伊斯蘭教徒咧係視佢為兄弟嘅喎，係唔當佢為一個係低等民族嘅喎。咁所以咧自此之後佢就對白人大為改觀啦。咁就開始咧想同呢個呢個即係倡導比較和平啲嘅民權運動嘅呢個 Martin Luther King 咧就合作咁樣樣。咁但係65年嗰陣時 Malcolm X 就被刺殺咯喎。咁啊有指就話呢個係Elijah Muhammad 嗰陣時係指刺㗎啦。咁 Malcolm X 咧佢對 hip hop 嘅影響咧就不勝枚舉嘅。咁早期嘅例子包括呢個 Keith LeBlanc 喺84年嘅呢隻 No Sellout。No Sellout。
Malcolm X. No sellout. Malcolm X. No sellout. White, black, brown, red, yellow. Doesn't make any difference what color you are. The only thing power respects is power. They take one little word out of what you say, ignore all the rest, and then begin to magnify it all over the world to make you look like what you actually are. Much of what I say might sound like it's stirring up trouble, but it's the truth. 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 It's the truth.
We don't care who likes it or not, as long as we know it's the truth.
其實 plan 咗50幾年都去唔到
非洲，根本唔想去非洲，如果去咗非洲，佢冇咗個 support base，
係咪先？即係而家個狀況就係咯，好似係咁樣喎，
我想問下，咁即係美國嘅黑人最後有冇形成到一個有系統啲嘅一個反抗運動？
嗱，咁講翻 Malcolm X 嘅死啦，
係咯，
咁以及係呢個68年嗰陣時 Martin Luther King 嘅呢個遇刺啦，
係，
咁呢個就深刻震動咗黑人嘅社會啦，咁就令到好多人喺驚覺咧係一定要進行武裝嘅呢個抗爭嘅，
武裝抗爭，
係啦，
即係揸槍㗎咯，
揸槍啊！咁當時咧美國嘅，
但係本身唔係話想高舉一個和平啲嘅。
因為連倡導和平民權運動嗰個 Martin Luther King 都俾人打死咗啊嘛，係啦，仲係俾白人打死嘅，即係 Malcolm X 係俾黑人打死嘅，但係 Martin Luther King 係俾白人打死嘅。咁啊當時咧呢個美國嘅共產主義運動咧已經係完全落後於形勢㗎啦。咁啊出任美共總書記有40年之久嘅呢個 Gus Hall 咧，曾經喺70、80年代嗰陣時都火拍黑人咧係競選呢個美國政府總統嘅。咁包括咧呢個美國嘅黑人 Angela Davis 啊。
Of course, I'm a member of the Communist Party of the United States of America. There is, of course, a relationship between all communist parties throughout the world, including the Communist Party of the Soviet Union.
咁但係 Gus Hall 嘅形象咧就好呆板，都僵硬嘅。
Good evening. Tomorrow the votes will be cast and counted. The 1972 elections will be history, but the issues will continue to be with us.
咁而且咧該黨啦或者我啦又深受呢個莫斯科遙控啦，咁已經係同68年之後形成嘅呢一個美國嘅新左派同埋黑人嘅呢個武裝鬥爭嘅呢一個咁嘅潮流咧係完全脫節㗎啦。咁甚至咧係有一啲嘅南部嘅州份咧，當時咧喺允許白人攜槍嘅同時咧，係明令禁止呢一個黑人攜槍㗎。咁於是咧喺加州三藩市對岸嘅呢個奧克蘭咧，就有一個黑人叫 Huey Newton。咁佢咧就為咗呢個對抗警暴咧，就喺66年嗰陣時組織呢個黑豹黨。咁建立咗一個攜帶槍械嘅民防隊嘅呢個咁樣嘅制度去巡邏啲街道嘅，咁去對抗呢個警察嘅呢個stop and search 之類咁樣嘅嘢。咁並且係為呢個窮苦嘅黑人咧，就建立好多啲咁嘅社區廚房嘅添。咁喺佢哋嘅10點宣言裏邊咧，甚至係明言咧係反抗呢個資本主義嘅。咁受文化大革命影響啦，當時美國都好多呢啲左派咧係好崇拜毛澤東嘅。咁黑豹黨嘅成員咧係着上呢個中山裝。中山裝。係啊，咁呢個就為日後嘅呢個政治嘅 rapper 咧 係所深切嘅懷念嘅。譬如話呢一個 Public Enemy 喺89年嘅呢一首嘅呢一個Fight the Power 咧，個 MV 咧就重現翻呢一個60年代嗰陣時呢啲 Black Panthers 着住黑中山裝巡邏街道嘅呢個咁樣嘅去示威嘅呢個咁嘅樣貌啦。
呢個名都好過癮啦 ，Public Enemy
係啊，
有首歌叫 Fight the Power， 呢個得了呢個。
咁當時咧，深恐呢個民防隊嘅加州州長叫列根啊，即係後來做咗總統嗰個咧。咁咧就喺67年嗰陣時就簽署咗一份嘅法案咧，就係呢一個禁止公開攜帶槍械嘅喎。咁啊，黑炮黨嘅組織咧，好快就喺美國各地咧建立分部啦。咁啊，並且被 FBI 稱為咧美國國內安全嘅呢個最大嘅威脅嚟嘅添。咁 FBI 當時係設立咗一個叫做 COINTELPRO 嘅一個咁樣嘅計劃咧。
咩意思咧？
我唔記得咗。大家可以見到呢一個嘅係啦，全稱係啊 COINTELPRO 係啦。咁咧就有系統咁樣咧，就去呢一個滲透呢個黑炮黨嘅組織啦。咁啊，故意挑起呢啲咁樣嘅過激嘅行為啦嚇，即係叫你哋殺警察啦嚇。係啊。咁咧就派員上門去搜查啦，並且係呢個亂槍掃射咁樣樣，即係好似我上你屋企嗰陣時做嘅嘢啦。咁係啦，咁黑炮黨咧自己亦都陷入於黑炮黨自己都陷入於各種嘅問題咯。咁譬如話對懷疑係臥底嘅成員啦，進呢個私刑啦嚇，甚至係處決啦。咁Huey Newton 亦都係呢一個挪用資金嚟去進行毒品交易啦等等。咁去咗70年代中後期咧，其實黑炮黨已經係失去咗呢個絕大部分嘅呢個政治影響力㗎啦。咁去咗71年嗰陣時咧，呢個黑人嘅詩人咧 Gilbert Heron 咧，即係頭先我哋提到呢一個咧，咁咧就寫咗呢一首嘅呢個革命係唔會上電視嘅呢一首歌嘅。咁呢首歌詞咧就係諷刺呢個消費主義同埋電視廣告嘅喎，包括有一句説話就係話咧，呢一個革命咧係唔會令你嘅口唇咧係變得性感嘅，係啦。咁呢一首嘅歌詞其實咧就嚴格嚟講咧係叫做 spoken word poetry 啦，就唔係 rap 嚟嘅。咁但係咧都可以話係開咗政治 rap 嘅先河嘅。咁主要就係話咧，真正嘅革命咧，只係可以咧存在喺你個頭裏邊嘅啫，喺你嘅思想裏邊。電視上嗰個係播唔到嘅。
The revolution will not give your mouth sex appeal. The revolution will not get rid of the nub. The revolution will not make you look 5 pounds thinner because the revolution will not be televised, brother. There will be no pictures of you and Willie Mae pushing that shopping cart down the block on the dead run or trying to slide that color TV into a stolen ambulance. NBC will not be able to predict the winner at 8:32 on report from 29 districts. The revolution will not be televised. There will be no pictures of pigs shooting down brothers on the instant replay. There will be no pictures of pigs shooting down brothers on the instant replay. The revolution will not be right back after a message about a white tornado, white lightning, or white people. You will not have to worry about a dove in your bedroom, the tiger in your tank, or the giant in your toilet bowl. The revolution will not go better with Coke. The revolution will not fight germs that may cause bad breath. The revolution will put you in the driver's seat. The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live.
我哋講翻 New York 咧，咁頭先你講到呢一種即係黑人反抗勢力嘅退潮，咁其實同 hip hop 嘅出現嗰個關係係喺邊咧？
嗱，要答呢個問題咧，就要討論一個中心嘅事件啦。咁呢個就係75年嗰陣時紐約嘅破產危機度。咁正如我剛才所講啦，呢個紐約當時咧流失數以百萬計嘅呢一個嘅白人中產嘅家庭，同埋佢哋嘅帶嚟嘅稅款啊。另外咧就係由於越戰同埋石油危機咧，美國經濟同埋國家咧陷入呢一個財政嘅呢個困難啦。喺失業潮底下咧，紐約市咧並冇大力去創造呢個職位，反而咧就不斷咁擴大呢個福利。最後咧就
咁但係佢自己政府一定冇晒錢㗎。
係啊，120萬人攞緊福利嗰陣時，政府係完全冇錢嘅。紐約市政府其實同一個時間咧，都喺度大力咁資助緊咧，就係大財團去喺紐約嘅市中心去起甲級寫字樓。
點解要咁樣做咧？
點解咧？因為係啦，理論上係咁樣樣，係啦。但係咧，實際上咧就係補貼啲大財團啦。咁當係補貼大財團嘅呢個開支咧，就佔咗佢哋30幾億美金咯。喺70年代初嗰陣時，紐約開始削減呢個咁樣嘅公共開支啦。其實好多削減嘅咧就唔係呢啲咁嘅保護大財團嘅東西，而係呢啲必要嘅服務，譬如話消防，譬如警察。結果火災同埋治安問題咧就成為咗一個該市嘅一個重點嘅問題啦。不善理財，而且要動用我可以咁講咧，經常用6個角嚟冚7個煲嘅呢個咁樣嘅紐約市政府啦。當時總共欠債幾多咧？就係120億美金啊！120億美金，即係整個越戰嘅開支10%。係啦，咁咧喺72年度嘅 GDP 裏邊咧，紐約市嘅呢個債務係佔1%嘅。咁所以咧係經常性開支亦都達到呢個7.5億美金嘅。喺當時嚟講呢一筆錢咧係難以想像。紐約咧當時咧就依靠好多嘅大嘅銀行啊、財團啊咁樣嚟去keep it afloat 啊，呢一個出手認購佢市政府嘅債券啦。但喺75年2月咧有一日咧，紐約市政府宣布呢個新債券發行嗰陣時，突然間咧呢啲咁嘅大銀行咧就宣布唔再買呢啲咁樣嘅債券咯。總統福特咧亦都宣布咧係唔出手去救紐約市政府。結果紐約市政府咧就基本上係宣布破產嘅。
In 1975, New York City was on the verge of collapse. For 30 years, the politicians who ran the city had borrowed more and more money from the banks to pay for its growing services and welfare. But in the early 70s, the middle classes fled from the city, and the taxes they paid disappeared with them. So the banks lent the city even more. But then they began to get worried about the size of the growing debt and whether the city would ever be able to pay it back. And then one day in 1975, the banks just stopped. The city held its regular meeting to issue bonds in return for the loans, overseen by the city's financial controller.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the City of New York is offering for competitive bidding sale 260 million tax anticipation notes, of which 100 million will mature on June 3rd, 1975.
The banks were supposed to turn up at 11 a.m. But it soon became clear that none of them were going to appear. The meeting was rescheduled for 2 p.m, and the banks promised they would turn up.
The announcement on behalf of the controller is that the offer, which we had expected to receive and announce at 2 o'clock this afternoon, is now expected at 4 o'clock.
Paul, does this mean that so far nobody wants those bonds?
We will be making a further announcement at 4 o'clock, and anything further that I could say now I think would not advance the interest of the sale, which is now in progress.
Does this mean that you have not been able to sell them so far today?
We will have a further announcement at 4 o'clock.
剛才見到嘅畫面咧，就係咧呢一個紐約市政府喺發行債券嘅嗰個大會上高咧，係等咗幾個鐘頭，等咗全日之後咧，都等唔到銀行嘅代表嚟到去認購債券嘅呢個場面嚟嘅。 咁最後呢啲銀行咧同埋一啲政治操盤人咧就夾咗一個
係喎，嗰時冇電腦喎。
係啊，
係真係一沓一沓咁買
打電話，之後咧我唔嚟㗎啦，
過嚟買我張債券啦咁。
係啦，咁結果咧就呢啲咁樣嘅銀行咧就形成咗一個叫做 Big Mac 嘅組織啦。咁咧 Big Mac 咧就係叫做市政援助工團啦嚇。咁嘅意思就係話咩咧？就係一個監督紐約市財政，並且強迫紐約市政府去還錢嘅一個咁嘅組織嚟嘅。咁呢個委員會提出削減市政府嘅4萬個職工喎。
咁即係再多啲人失業。
係啦，咁咧。包括4萬嘅職工，係包括幾十個呢啲咁樣嘅消防局啦，同埋好多嘅啲咁嘅差館嘅。咁最後連呢啲咁嘅紀律部隊咧都發動工業行動嘅。咁正如剛才所講啦嚇，就紐約市咧早喺70年代嗰陣時咧就已經係嘗試去削減公共嘅呢個服務㗎啦。譬如話71年嗰陣時，市長呢一個 John Lindsay 咧就要求消防總長呢個 John O'Hagan 咧係削減幾百萬美金嘅呢個開支。咁幾百萬美金咧，相對於呢個紐約市政府補貼大財團咧，即係不值一提啦。呢個數額
啱啊。
咁但係咧就佢要填補其他嘅氹喎。咁結果就要消防局去 cut 啦。咁 John O'Hagan就諗到一個辦法，佢就當時睇到咧紐約咧同埋美國咧開始就電腦化啦。咁於是咧佢就揾美國最大嘅智庫叫 Rand Corporation。咁就要求佢哋用我哋而家覺得好原始嘅啦，但係當時係好犀利嘅超級電腦去計算紐約各區嘅呢個消防局嘅呢個 response time 係啦，照達時間。咁邊個區嘅 response time 係短嘅話咧，就 cut 邊個地區嘅呢個消防局；邊個地區嘅 response time 長嘅話咧，就起嗰個消防局。咁結果咧，新起嘅呢個咁樣嘅消防局咧，就集中喺白人區啦嚇，大家估到咩事啦？cut 嘅消防局就集中喺黑人區啦，大家估到咩事啦嚇？其實呢個咁超簡單嘅運算嘅方法咧，個問題咧就係譬如話，假設火災嗰陣時係一定有消防隊可以出到去救火嘅，其實唔係一定噶嘛。人口稠密嗰陣時，可以所有消防隊出晒去呢個救火噶嘛，根本係冇人可以應召噶嘛。咁所以咧喺咁樣嘅情況底下咧，John O'Hagan咧發現有一啲數，計出嚟個樣唔似我想要喎，再計過。都係唔掂，再計過，計到我中意嗰個樣為止。咁咧，當時咧有啲當事人就話咧，如果你想削減一個法官所住嘅嗰條街上高嘅一個消防局嘅話咧，係冇可能嘅，因為邊個地方咧有重要嘅政治操盤人嘅話咧，或者有當地嘅有影響力嘅人士嘅話咧，你係唔會削減到當地嘅呢個服務噶嘛。咁所以最後被削減嘅就係呢啲咁嘅黑人區啊、波多黎各人住嘅區嘅呢啲咁嘅消防局啦，因為嗰啲咁嘅地方咧，政治能量少啦嚇，反抗能力低啦嚇，就不如白人嘅地區一樣咧，係有呢啲咁嘅政治操盤人咧係所呢個撐腰嘅。
即係換句話嚟講咧，就係頭先你講嗰啲咩 Bronx 啊、哈林啊嗰啲地區就係啦，
好多哈林啊嗰啲。
哦，但係咧有冇啲咩因素即係？南布朗克斯啦，即係南 Bronx 啦、South Bronx 啦，咁就大家都知頭先講咗好耐啦，都係啲貧民區。咁亦都削咗消防局啦，但係你冇火，唔使救火噶嘛，咁點解咁多火嘅？
係啦，所以話呢個 South Bronx 形成一個貧民窟咧，其實有好多嘅原因嘅。咁首先就喺50年代嗰陣時咧，南北布朗克斯咧就俾一條橫貫嘅公路切斷成兩半咯喎。咁結果咧。大家發現啲咩就係佢呢條公路嘅設計者咧，叫做呢個 Robert Moses 咧，其實係一個非常之種族歧視嘅人嚟嘅。咁係做咗好多好陰質嘅事情咧，刁難啲黑人嘅。譬如話咩咧？譬如話專登將公共泳池擠喺白人區啦嚇，即係啲黑人行喺白人區會俾人打噶嘛，咁你就唔會去游水啦嚇。譬如話海灘啊，海灘通過海灘嘅公路咧，將條橋起到好低嘅。黑人都係搭唔到呢個私家車㗎嘛，係淨係可以搭呢個巴士，巴士去唔到佢就去唔到游水㗎嘛，所以咧就阻止黑人咧去白人可以去到嘅海灘游水啦，咁樣樣。哇！咁所以咧喺啲火災擴散咗之後咧，南布朗克斯區嘅條件就進咗惡化咯。咁大量嘅物業咧難以出售啦嚇，咁只係能夠作為一啲極低水準嘅呢啲咁樣嘅公寓咧嚟出租嘅。咁租客咧亦都攞到政府嘅津貼喎。咁但係有啲咁樣嘅 landlord 就計咗出嚟就係話咧，不如咧 將嗰間大廈燒咗佢咧，嚟去呢個呃呢個保險仲好過。而燒咗佢嘅話咧，嗰啲咁樣嘅住客咧，仲可以輪候公屋嘅呢個咁嘅排隊咧，係可以打尖嘅添。咁所以咧，消防隊咧就將呢個南布魯克斯區70年代視為呢個戰爭嘅年代。咁永遠咧就係去到呢一個咁樣嘅燒嘅大樓嘅門前咧，發現嗰啲住客已經係執好晒細軟噶啦，所有嘅啲咁 furniture 已經係堆好晒，係準備上車噶啦。後邊火災車入去救啦咁樣樣。咁咧喺77年嗰陣時咧，總統卡特咧就曾經嚟過咧，係前呼後擁一個大車隊嘅一個咁樣嘅情況底下咧，就嚟到呢個 South Bronx 咧就去視察喎，就話我哋一定要搞翻掂呢一區嘅。當然冇咗件事啦嚇。咁列根咧去競選總統嗰陣時咧，亦都係提出同一樣嘅呢一個咁樣嘅即係承諾喎，仲喺度同人講嗱，你同我講嗰啲嘢冇用㗎，你選唔到我上去嘅話，我而家應承啲咩都冇用㗎啦，係咪？咁所以選咗上去之後咧，佢就繼續 cut 呢個開支，係啊。咁所以咧，
所以真係冇用嘅。
南布魯克斯區嘅呢一個咁樣嘅 reputation 咧，就傳去國外添。譬如話喺法文裏邊咧，譬如話朝頭早呢一個呢個地鐵繁忙時間壞咗 ，c'est le Bronx 係嘛？呢個父母爭吵家無寧日 ，c'est le Bronx 係嘛？呢個就係布魯克斯啦咁樣。咁但係即使係咁樣樣咧，紐約人咧仍然係以作為呢個紐約人咧係自豪嘅。譬如話 Odyssey 77年嘅呢一首歌嘅就係一個咁樣嘅例子啦。
其實 rap 呢樣嘢係真係真係咁新嘅一樣嘢咩？即係我哋頭先都喺度講緊中國古代都有一樣嘢叫蓮花落啦，係咪？即係佢哋好似係即係一路半 rap， 跟住一路敲住竹板咁樣。所以其實有咁新咩 hip hop 呢樣嘢呢個 genre？
其實冇錯嘅，rap 嘅歷史咧係非常之久遠嘅。咁喺古希臘啦嚇，甚至呢一個古代嘅西非咧，都有 rap 嘅傳統嘅。咁經過奴隸嘅販賣之後咧，呢個西非嘅 rap 嘅傳統又傳咗去牙買加等地啦嚇。咁輾轉就去咗美國喎。咁呢段歷史咧，我哋今日咧好難即係好清楚咁解釋啦嚇。我亦都唔係專家。咁但係咧，可能要留待呢一個下一集。但我可以講嘅係咩？就係最早嘅 rap 嘅錄音咧，可能係30年代喎。因為當時咧 spoken word poetry 咧已經係一個具備現代嘅 rap 嘅特性嘅一個東西嚟㗎啦，即係有現代 rap 嘅呢一個速度同埋節奏等等啦。譬如呢一個英美籍嘅左派詩人咧，叫做 W.H. Auden 咧，喺36年嗰陣時就為英國嘅郵政總局咧就創作咗一隻叫 Night Mail 嘅一首咁樣嘅詞啦。咁講嘅咧就係由倫敦深夜去到呢個蘇格蘭嘅火車上高咧，係有一個好大型嘅流動郵局㗎喎。
Letters of thanks, letters from banks, letters of joy from the girl and the boy, receipted bills and invitations to inspect new stock or to visit relations, and applications for situations and timid lovers, declarations and gossip from all the nations, news circumstantial, news financial, letters with holiday snaps to enlarge in, letters with faces scrawled in the margin, letters from uncles, cousins and aunts, letters to Scotland from the south of France, letters of condolence to Highlands and Lowlands, notes from overseas to Hebrides, written on paper of every hue, the pink, the violet, the white and the blue, the chatty, the catty, the boring, adoring, the cold and official, all the hearts outpouring, clever, stupid, short and long, the typed and the printed and spelt all wrong.
而最早用 rap 呢隻字咧嚟去形容喺音樂背景上高講説話嘅嗰個人咧，就係頭先唱呢個 Shaft 嘅嗰個 Isaac Hayes。咁雖然咧速度相當慢啊，即係我哋今日完全唔會當佢係 rap 嘅。咁但係咧佢呢首歌咧，或者係其實係3個 part 嘅呢首歌，就叫做Ike's Rap 咁樣。
Yeah, my friends tease me and tell me I got a love Jones. I know I am, and I'm not ashamed of it. You see, if they were getting what you're giving me, they'd have a love Jones too. You see, 'cause loving ain't loving unless it's coming from you. And if some chump would rip you off me,I wouldn't be responsible for my actions thereafter.
好啦，咁我哋剛才提到牙買加呢個地方啦，咁咪同好多音樂種類唔一樣嘅地方就係咩咧？就係、我哋好清楚 hip hop 嘅誕生嘅嗰一日咧，係歷史上高係邊一日？就係1973年嘅8月11號啦，晚上喺布魯克斯區咧，一個牙買加嚟嘅 DJ 咧叫做 Kool Herc， 即係叫 Clive Campbell 啦嚇。咁佢就舉行咗一個街區派對，即係 block party。咁就喺一個公屋嘅呢一個娛樂室裏邊咧，請嚟咗附近嘅街坊咧，就喺嗰度搞咗一個臨時嘅 disco 咁樣嘅。咁 Kool Herc 當晚咧，亦都有 rap 咁樣，即係所謂嘅呢個 MC 啦。咁佢嘅風格咧係受到牙買加嘅呢一個 rap 所謂嘅toasting 所影響嘅。咁但係佢嘅最大嘅貢獻咧，就係用咗2個而唔係1個嘅唱盤嚟去播歌嘅。咁然之後喺刻意咧就喺歌嘅 bridge， 即係歌詞之間嘅嗰一段音樂上高咧嚇，或者叫 break 啦，佢哋叫做。咁通常呢一段咧就好重 percussion 嘅。咁佢就將呢一段咁樣嘅 bridge 咧一邊播完之後就輪到另一邊播，再到另一邊播，再到另一邊播。咁將幾秒或者10幾秒長嘅 bridge 咧就變咗做幾廿分鐘咁長嘅。咁並且咧佢自己 rap 亦都唔係 rap 幾分鐘，而係 rap 成幾個鐘咁樣咯。咁所以咧呢種咁嘅 technique 就叫做 merry-go-round， 即係旋轉木馬。咁關鍵咧就係在於係有2個唱盤嘅。咁唔好話當時啦嚇。而家黑膠唱盤咧都唔係平嘅，咁所以咧特別係當時係要用一種係用齒輪帶動嘅一個咁嘅唱片，而唔係皮帶帶動嘅唱片。皮帶帶動唱片你捽佢嘅話係會斷嘅皮帶，用齒輪捽嘅話先捽到碟嘅。
There's a recreation room for the building. You rent the room. That's what we did. So this was a breath of fresh air for us going somewhere we could hear some music. Turned out to be a success.
Herc was one of the first DJs in the Bronx to borrow a technique from Manhattan's downtown discotheques, the use of 2 turntables. This meant DJs could play music without interruption, mixing from the end of one record straight into the beginning of another. But unlike other DJs, Herc didn't play disco music. Instead, he specialised in the kind of hard-edged funk music that others ignored.
Yeah, I remember going to the Herc parties and just started in the community room, and it grew so big that we couldn't fit in the community room anymore. And music was just, it was slamming. I was trying to think about what would be, I guess, synonymous with a Kool Herc party. And it would have to be James Brown. Clap your hands, stomp your feet. It wasn't a Kool Herc party. Without
have a very party here.
Exactly.
呢個問題咧，解決嘅方法咧就好簡單嘅，就喺77年嘅呢個7月13號晚咧，紐約市發生咗一場好大嘅停電。係。咁停電當時咧，呢啲嘅黑人咧就去搶晒音響店裏邊嘅所有嘅設備同埋電子嘅儀器。咁結果咧，從此之後咧，呢一個咁樣嘅紐約咧就唔係有幾個 DJ， 而係有幾十甚至幾百個 DJ， 甚至幾百個 rapper 咁樣嘅。
Everybody was like, hit the stores. And it was like, hit the stores. And everybody just started running all at once.
running towards us. Me and Wiz, we had other ideas, okay? We pull out the guns, we like, no, run that way, okay? Don't run this way, run that way. Wiz stayed with the equipment and I proceeded around the corner because there was an electronics store, the Sound Room, and they had DJ equipment in there. And this is my first time admitting this, telling this story, but yes, I did sneak in there, help crash the gate down, and crawl in and pull out a Clubman 2 mixer. But like I said, you couldn't just say, I'm gonna be a DJ. You needed equipment. And that's all I really, wanted. I wasn't trying to loot, everything I could find.
咁咧呢啲人咧，當時咧攞到呢啲咁嘅新嘅設備之後咧，就喺呢啲廢墟上高嘅空地咧，就去舉辦呢啲 block party 咯喎。係。咁啊，如果冇電力供應嘅話咧，好簡單嘅啫，就係撬開嗰個燈柱上高嗰塊牌咧，咁就可以咧駁到電㗎啦，咁樣樣。咁啊，此前咧好多互相廝殺嘅幫派咧，因為有咗啲 block party 之後，竟然都可以相安無事咧，就喺個 party 上高互相一齊跳舞嘅，都唔爭女啊嘛，可能爭啦，不過我唔知道啦，即係冇記載啦。咁我哋可以聽到最早嘅紐約嘅 rap 嘅呢一個錄音咧，即係唔係商業嘅錄音，而係一啲私人嘅錄音咧，就係通常係7、8年左右錄音嘅。咁啊，當時咧呢一個係修讀過點樣去修理電子儀器嘅呢個僆仔咧，叫 Joseph Sadler 咧，咁就自此轉行咧做咗一個 DJ 咯。咁個藝名就叫做 Grandmaster Flash 嘅。咁佢主要貢獻咧就係第一咧就係令到捽碟聲咧即係咔咔咔咔咔，咁咧就變咗做音樂嘅一部分。第二咧就係佢唔係用2個唱盤嚟捽，佢用3個唱盤嚟捽，1、2、3咁樣樣嘅。咁我哋睇下佢點捽咯喎。
Have a good day. The official adventures of the Great Master Flash.
咁早期嘅 block party 嘅呢個 rap 嘅方法咧，都可以話係完全冇章法嘅。咁基本上諗到咩就講咩啦，因為你要 rap 幾個鐘頭噶嘛。咁
幾個鐘啊？
幾個鐘，係啊，
即係唔停咁樣係咁講。
可能通宵添，係啊。咁所以咧就呢一個咁樣嘅情況底下咧，大家可以聽下喺個諗唔到 rap 啲咩嘅情況底下可以點 rap 咧，就係諗下我細嗰陣時聽過咩兒歌咧咁樣。
Freak, y'all. Y'all say the grand, that's the plan. The disco, the 4 MCs that are rockin' G&E's with a knick-knack, tic-tac, that don't get no slack. 4 words for the whack, say the hell back. And back in 4, forth and back. 4 words for the whack, say the hell back. So the whack me attack, we keep the whack back. The funk machine is guaranteed to cause a heart attack. Rock, y'all, and don't stop. There wasn't no mouse who lived on the hill who fought and saw at like Buffalo Bill. Until one day I went for a ride with an Echo Tamer by my side. I rode up to his mousey door and then I knock to my knuckles I saw. I sat Miss Mousey on my knee and asked the will she marry me. And then Miss Mousey said, I can't see that. You have to ask my brother Rat. Say my brother Rat is going to town. Steal me one of those wedding gowns. And after that, they had 10 mics. I was caught in the corner, shoot and dice to the beat, y'all, y'all.
因為剛才呢隻歌用嘅 sample 都好出名嘅喎，咁係 Incredible Bongo Band 嘅嗰隻 Apache， 咁咧就係人稱嘅 hip hop 國歌嘅，咁係73年嘅一首歌嚟，咁呢個 sample 基本上係俾 hip hop 嘅嗰啲界別嘅人咧係所謂 sample to death 嘅。但係早期 hip hop 嘅另一個特點咧，就係並唔係一定用呢個預先錄製嘅 sample 嘅喎，而係可以廣泛利用 live band 嘅。
live band
係啊，咁跟住落嚟咧，我會講到3張最早嘅 hip hop 嘅唱片咧，全部都用 live band 嚟錄音嘅。咁之所以講到呢3張咧，因為咧 hip hop 嘅歷史咧嘅學界咧，對於邊一張係最早嘅 hip hop 唱片咧係有爭議嘅喎。咁一般嘅理解就係咧。最早嘅商業 hip hop 嘅唱片咧，就係 Sugar Hill Gang 嘅呢個 Rapper's Delight 嘅。咁但係咧，其實呢個係一個誤解嚟嘅喎，因為更加早嘅咧就係喺79年3月25號推出嘅 Fatback Band 嘅呢一個 Kingston III。
Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome to the bandstand a young man who's making a mark for himself. Ladies and gentlemen, King Tim the Third.
And do this with me one time, y'all. Just clap your hands, everybody. Everybody just clap your hands, Just clap your hands, everybody. Everybody just clap your hands, Just clap your hands and you stop the beat, cause you're listening to the sound of the show shot beat. K-I-N-G-T-I-M, King Tim the Third. I am him, just be back in the groove, doing it all just for you. Strong as an ox, tall as a tree. I can rock you so viciously. Throw the highs in your eyes, the bass in your face. Fuck machine, just rock you to the bass. Stay down for your shot. Come on, girl, let's do the rock. Go slam, jump, you jerk. Let's see your body work. Check it out, y'all. To my beat, everybody. To my beat, everybody. 2, 4, 6, 8. Fatback, don't you hesitate. All you people who like to groove, now's the time to make your body move.
而呢個 Fatback Band 咧，本來係一個 funk 嘅樂隊嚟嘅，咁最出名嘅就係呢首75年嘅叫做 Bus Stop 嘅歌，咁都好反映紐約嘅呢一個依賴公共交通運輸嘅呢一個咁嘅特點啊。 住落嚟，我哋會講到咧就係 disco 文化嘅無聲咧係點樣直接幫助 rap 嘅呢個傳播嘅。咁啊，首先就係 Cool Star Child 喺當時咧，其實先至係最早獲得呢一個唱片公司簽約嘅一個 rapper 嚟嘅。咁而早期嘅 rap 嘅 disco 嘅性格咧，亦都好可以喺 Cool Star Child 嘅呢首歌裏邊咧所表現出嚟嘅。
Welcome to the party, everybody. I'm glad that you could attend. We're gonna rock, shock, scream, and shout to the beat that has no end. Now you listen to the #1 rocket MC. Rocking the world is my fantasy. My name is Cool Kyle. They call me Star Child. Just shocking the house for a little while. I'm 6 feet tall, full of joy. To all the young ladies, I'm just a playboy. 21 years old. It should be known I'm the high-power lover of the microphone. Now New York City is my home. I'm all I rock the mic. I like to get it on. Born under the side of Scorpio, I make you work your body nice and slow. I'm the K-O, the O, the L. I got a telephone book for clientele. All the fly girls wanna ring my bell. I'm the K-Y-L, the E. Just boogie to the rhythm of the Star Child beat.
我想問翻咧，頭先你有講到係咪 Sugar Hill Gang 嗰首 Rapper's Delight？ 咁就係即係公認係商業嘅第一首 rap 歌。咁其實可唔可以講下，即係點解會係嗰首係 commercial 嘅嗰首 rap 歌咧？
呢個故仔牽涉兩個好重要嘅女人喎。咁咧，首先咧就係要了解咧就係呢一個70年代嘅紐約咧係一個創造力爆炸嘅地方嚟嘅。咁通常亂嘅地方咧就有相應嘅創造力爆炸啦嚇。咁同時咧喺紐約咧出現咗呢一個 punk 啦、disco 同埋 rap 嘅3種嘅啲文化嘅。咁亦都有一個好大嘅藝術家嘅群體嘅，咁集中喺曼克頓嘅呢個 Lower East Side 嘅。咁喺呢個群體當中呢個活躍嘅人物就係 Debbie Harry， 咁亦都即係 Blondie 嘅主音啦。Debbie Harry 咧係一個 network 相當犀利嘅一個女人嚟嘅，因為相識係遍天下咁講。咁包括78年嗰陣時，相當呢一個受歡迎嘅 disco 樂隊啦，吉他手 Nile Rodgers， 佢亦都係呢個黑豹黨嘅成員曾經，同埋呢個 bass 手 Bernard Edwards 所組成嘅 Chic 嘅樂隊。咁 Blondie 同埋 Chic 咧，當時咧係有一齊參加一啲 hip hop 嘅一啲派對嘅，咁亦都有同台演出嘅喎。咁有一次咧就喺 Chic 嘅彈奏呢個 disco 經典之作 Good Times 嘅時候咧，Sugar Hill Gang 嘅有幾個嘅 MC 咧就跑上台上高，咁即興演出咗。咁當時咧就發現原來都好夾嘅喎，咁樣。咁於是咧 Rapper's Delight 嘅呢一個嘅雛形咧就出現咗啦。咁我先俾大家聽下咧呢個 Good Times 嘅呢一個 bassline 係點樣嘅。當時咧呢一個 Chic 嘅 Good Times 嘅 bassline 嘅流傳咧係極為廣泛嘅喎。咁另外一個咧好有早期嘅影響力嘅一個 MC 咧就係叫 DJ Hollywood。咁係好多一啲咁樣嘅早期嘅 DJ 咧都係視佢為一個榜樣嘅。咁喺79年嗰陣時咧 DJ Hollywood 咧就係以呢條 bassline 咧嚟去做一個基礎去 rap 咗一首歌，
就係 Chic 嘅 bassline。
係啦，
但係呢個就叫 sampling。
冇錯，係啦。
Hey, you don't stop, I keep on. I just a hip hip the hop, but don't stop. Everybody, come on, let's party rock. Now I rock the freak and I freak the rock. Now I'm playing the music and I just can't stop. Once again, with a feeling that's so divine. Let's have a. That's right, Joe. Let's do it. Let's do it. All right, now we got all the people in the house in the back. They ready to rock. All you people in the front, just turn around and get somebody kind of punk rock. I took the beat. Come on down, let's punk rock a little bit. Oh, shit.
咁啊，另外一首咧，我諗大家一定聽講過嘅就係呢一個 Queen 嘅 Another One Bites the Dust。咁啊，呢一首歌嘅嗰個 bass line 就係嚟自 Chic 嘅呢個 Good Times， 只不過改少少。咁點解咧？要根據 Bernard Edwards 嘅講法咧，就係Queen 嘅呢個 bass 手咧，當時係經常同埋呢個 Chic 嘅呢一個嗰班人咧係撈埋一齊嘅，並且咧係成日入去佢哋 studio 嗰度偷師嘅添。咁啊，當時咧，紐約有一個唱片公司叫做 Sugar Hill Record。咁Sugar Hill 咧係紐約一個區嚟嘅。因為唱片公司老闆咧係一個獨具慧眼嘅女商人啦，叫做 Sylvia Robinson。
呢個同 Sugar Hill Gang 係咪有？
有，係啦，因為 Sugar Hill Gang 係佢講出嚟嘅。係啦，咁佢Sylvia Robinson 自己都係歌手嚟嘅喎。最出名嗰首應該就係唱過咧，就係 Pillow Talk 呢首歌嘅。喺70年代末嗰陣時，其實 Sylvia Robinson 係主要係推廣一啲咧係 disco 嘅樂隊嘅，譬如呢個 Positive Force 咁樣樣咯。
disco 呢一個 culture 咧，唔係之前應該咁講，之前 disco music 其實係包唔包括 hip hop 唔包括。唔包括。跟住之後慢慢而家逐漸 hip hop 啊 rap 就會係 converge 係take over 添。
差唔多係啊。於是我哋嚟到咧呢個 Rapper's Delight 呢首歌咯喎。咁啊亦都即係 Sylvia Robinson 推動之下呢個出現嘅。咁Chic 咧喺開頭咧聽到嗰陣時咧係相當憤怒嘅添嘅喎。點解嘅？並且告到佢上法庭，因為佢偷咗佢個 bass line 啊嘛。哦。又唔俾翻 credit。咁最後咧庭外和解嘅條件咧就係俾翻 Rogers 同埋呢一個 Edwards 兩個人咧呢個作曲家嘅呢個咁樣嘅 credit 嘅。啊。咁啊時至今日咧，其實 Now Rogers 咧逢有 concert 嗰陣時咧，都一定係會奏呢個 Rapper's Delight 嘅喎。咁包括我喺即係19年嗰陣時喺呢個 Glasgow 聽呢個 Now Rogers 嘅呢個 concert 咧，佢都有呢個要求係呢個奏 Rapper's Delight 嘅。咁大家可以留意咧，就係呢個 MV 裏邊嘅裝束咧，仍然係 disco 嘅裝束嚟嘅喎，而唔係 hip hop 嘅裝束。咁至於點解 hip hop 叫做 hip hop 咧？咁大家可以聽下第一首呢首歌嘅第一句就會知道啦。
Here's Wonder Mike, Hank, and Master G, the Sugar Hill Gang.
The hip-hop, you don't stop. You rock it out, baby, rubber to the boogity bang bang, the boogie to the boogity beat. Now what you hear is not a test, I'm rapping to the beat. And me, the groove, and my friends are gonna try to move your feet. You see, I am Wonder Mike, and I like to say hello. To the black, to the white, the red, and the brown, the purple, and yellow. But first, I gotta bang, bang, the boogie to the boogie. Say up, jump the boogie to the bang, bang, boogie. Let's rock. You don't stop, rock the rhythm that'll make your body rock. Well, so far you've heard my voice, but I brought two friends along. And next on the mic is my man Hank. Come on, Hank, sing that song. Check it out. When I'm imp, the dimp, the ladies pimp, The women fight for my delight, but I'm the grand master with the 3 MCs that shock the house for the young ladies. And when you come inside into the front, you do the freak spank or do the bump. And when the sucker MCs try to prove a point with Trent's trio, or with a serious joiner from sun to sun and from day to day, I sit down and write a brand new rhyme because they say that miracles never cease. I've created a devastating masterpiece. I'm gonna rock the mic so you can't resist. Everybody, I say it goes like this. While I was coming home late one dark afternoon, reporter stopped me for an interview. She said she's heard stories and she's heard fables that are vicious on the mic and the turntable. This young reporter I did adore, so I rocked the vicious rhyme like I never did before. She said, damn fly guy, I'm in love with you. And Casanova legend must have been true. I said, by the way, baby, what's your name? Said I go by the name Lois Lane, and you can be my boyfriend, you surely can. Just let me quit my boyfriend called Superman. I said, he's a fairy, I do suppose, flying through the air in pantyhose. He may be very sexy or even cute, but he looks like a sucker in a blue and red suit. I said, you need a man who's got finesse and his whole name across his chest. He may be able to fly all through the night, but can he rock a party till the early light? He can't satisfy you with his little worm, but I can bust you out with my super sperm. I go do it, I go do it, I go do it, do it, do it. And I'm here, and I'm there, I'm Big Bang Hank, I'm everywhere.
咁由於咧有 disco 嘅熱潮助陣啦 ，Rapper's Delight 係一個超乎想像嘅成功嚟嘅。特別係想像到呢一個 Rapper's Delight 喺之前咧根本就冇一個成例可以言嘅。咁呢首歌咧喺1979年8月2號推出咗之後咧，咁喺12月嗰陣時就已經達到咗美國嘅蘇寧單曲榜嘅第4位咯喎。咁而且喺呢個歐洲咧受歡迎嘅程度咧係更加深嘅。80年1月嗰陣時咧已經去到荷蘭嘅榜首，英國單曲榜嘅第3位。咁喺美國咧一共售出咗200幾萬張嘅唱片嘅，賺取咗350萬美金。咁如果大家仲記得嘅話咧，就係、之前講話呢個紐約消防局咧要 cut 呢一個 budget 咧，所 cut 嘅數目字應該就係差唔多呢一個數目字啦。咁好快咧呢一首歌咧喺德國就有模仿者啦。咁喺80年4月嗰陣時就出咗一首叫做 Rapper's Deutsch 嘅歌。
Sag mal Hip Hop, the Hibbit, the Hibbit, the Hip Hip Hop with the Beat. Und nun Hip Hop, the Hibbit, the Hibbit, the Hip Hip Hop with the Beat.
Hey, es ist schon lange her, ich weiß gar nicht mehr, wie es so richtig begann. Das war die Beatles-Zeit, der Mersey-Sound, den ich einfach super fand.
Die Fortunes spielten im Storyville, die Beatles im Top 10. Die Stones, die Shadows, die Kings, die Who, die waren unerhört in. Zum Starclub fuhren wir, waren ganz irr, wenn doch mal richtig was lief. Die Liverbirds, die Remo 4, Rory Young, die Pretty Things.
值得留意嘅就係咩？就係、早期 Block Party 嘅 rap 咧係缺乏 storyline 嘅問題咧，就好早獲得解決喎。79年底嗰陣時 ，Curtis Blow 咧成為第一個獲得大唱片公司 Mercury Records 簽合同嘅呢個 rapper。並喺10月嗰陣時喺呢個聖誕檔期咧就推出咗一首叫 Christmas Rapping 嘅一首咁嘅歌，就講聖誕老人出巡，並且咧係會派呢個 Hi-Fi 啊、Stereo 啊、Turntable 啊等等嘅。咁結果咧呢一個 Curtis Blow 咧就呢個唱片就大賣啦。Christmas Rapping 咧賣咗40幾萬張，佢之後嘅嗰一隻叫 The Breaks 咧都賣咗50幾萬張嘅。並且80年1月咧成為第一個上到 BBC 嘅呢個嘅 rapper。值得留意就係咩咧？就係、當時第一啦呢、個Curtis Blow 係着住西裝㗎啦。咁好多呢啲咁嘅留言嘅人都話點解會着到咁老土嘅西裝咧？大家見到我着呢一套咧，都係想模仿佢嘅。咁我係咪好老土啊？係。另外咧就係、唱片嘅封面咧，就係、Curtis Blow 咧喺紐約市政府嘅勞工局嘅西域救濟處門口嗰度咧，就係、擺 pose 喎。
頭先你話 BBC 係咪即係電視嗰個？
電視 BBC 係啊。
Hit it! Don't you give me all that jive about things you wrote on both eyes alive. But this ain't 1823, ain't even 1970. Now I'm the guy named Curtis Blow, and Christmas is one thing I know. So every year, just about this time, I celebrate it with a rhyme. Bought a red suited dude with a friendly attitude and a sleigh full of goodies for the people on the block. Got a long white beard, maybe looks kinda weird, and if you ever see him, he can give it quite a shock. People, let me tell you about last year when the dude came flying over here. Well, the hawk was out, the snow was on the ground. Folks stayed in to party down. The beat was thumping on the box, and I was dancing in the socks. And the the drummer played at a solid pace. And the taste of the bass was in my face. And the guitar player laid down a heavy layer of the funky junky rhythm of the disco beat. Check it out, New York, and the guy with the AEA started to participate, and I guess you appreciate a sound so sweet. We were all in the mood, so we had a little food and a joke and a smoke and a little bit of wine when I thought I heard a whoop on the top of the roof. Could it be it wasn't me? I was feeling super fine, so I went to the attic where I thought I heard a static on the chance that the rent was somebody breaking in. Put the noise on the top was a reindeer clock, just a trick, Saint Nick, and I let the sucker in. He was holy moly, and I said holy moly, you got a lot of wishes on your chinny chin chin.
咁其實 rap 係幾時開始上電視嘅咧？
嗱，其實咧有兩個日子嘅。頭先第一所講嘅就係呢個80-1月咧，就係上到呢一個咁樣嘅英國嘅電視啦。咁可能再早啲嗰陣時咧，就已經可以上到一啲美國嘅電視嘅節目。咁但係咧上到 MTV 咧就好遲喎，因為當時 MTV 係唔肯播黑人歌嘅，係淨係播 rock 嘅啫。disco 都唔多想播嘅添，咁跟住
贏完之後都唔想播，
都唔想播，係啦。咁我哋之後咧講到呢一個剛才講到 Debbie Harry 啦嚇，咁佢係最早灌錄 rap 唱片嘅女歌手，但係就唔係最早嘅女 rapper， 但係佢係最早上到 MTV 嘅呢一個 rap 嘅歌手嚟嘅。點
解咧？
因為咧
個女 rapper
係啦，嗱我答咗你呢個問題先。咁嗱呢個最早嘅女 rapper 其實咧。個名銜就應該屬於一個叫 Sharrock 嘅人，咁啊 Sharrock 咧係short for Sharon Green 啦嚇，咁佢喺80年11月21至23號嗰陣時咧，就喺 Debbie Harry 嘅邀請底下咧，就去咗佢搞嘅一個 event 叫 Dubbed and Glamour 嘅呢個 event 嗰度咧就 rap 咗，咁咧當時佢嘅呢一個組合咧就叫做 Funky 4 Plus One More 嘅。
Check it out. Shop rock, don't stop, just get on your mind when you're ready to rock.
Cause the sun won't shine, the rain won't stop. We got the style you call punk rock. Just get about the jail, stop to have some fun. With two DJs from the 4 plus 1 to the people out there, we want y'all to know. We are the ones with the magical show. With two DJs and 5 MCs, 4 other fellas plus 1 is me. We're here to please everybody out there. Forget about the problems, get about your hands. Just get on the floor, don't you be shy. You can do it too, just give it a try. People out there, we want the best. Special guarantee is what we possess. Put it back on the mic with a master plan. We do it for the girl, for the boy, and man. Most people go around just thinking anyway. We want you to hear what we say. The things we say, the things we do. It's like running the race and the low come through. That's a lie, the competition to be. But we are the ones, they are the ones. I am the one with the motion, me. The fucking 4 got rhymes galore. I'm the plus 1 more shine, and I'm down below. Rock well, don't stop my level. Just get on the mic. Just get on the mic, just get on the mic when you're ready to rock. Check it out, y'all.
咁喺81年1月嗰陣時咧 ，Blondie 都自己推出咗一張 rap 嘅唱片咯喎。咁名字咧就係呢個 Rapture 嘅。咁並且話咧 ，Flash is fast, Flash is cool。咁咧就係對 Grandmaster Flash 同埋布魯克斯文化咧，作為一個致敬嘅。咁呢首 video 咧喺81年1月嘅31號咧，成為咗第一條可以上到 MTV 嘅 rap 嘅 video。咁大家要記得咧，就係頭先我所講嘅就係 rap 喺當時咧係根本上唔到 MTV， 不特止黑人歌都係上唔到 MTV 嘅添。咁所以咧先至話咧 ，Debbie Harry 咧係第一個上到 MTV 嘅 rap 嘅歌手，因為佢係一個白人。
81年都仲係咁
封閉係啦。
Fab Five Freddy told me everybody slide. DJ spinning, I said my. Flash is fast, Flash is cool. Francois c'est pas Flash ain't no dude. And you don't stop, sure shot. Go out to the parking lot and you get in your car and drive real far. And you drive all night and then you see a light and it comes right down and lands on the ground. And out comes a man from Mars. And you try to run but you got a gun. And he shoots you dead and he eats your head. And then you're in the man from Mars. You go out at night. Cars, you eat Cadillacs, Lincolns too, Mercuries and Subaru, and you don't stop, you keep on in the rain, paint the train. You'll be singing in the rain. Say don't stop to punk rock.
之後咧，呢個 Grandmaster Flash 馬上又回禮啦，咁 mix 咗一首 sample 咗呢一個 Rapture 嘅 Debbie Harry 嘅歌詞嘅一首歌啦。
其實我想問翻咧 ，Debbie 咧，佢嗰首歌咧出咗街之後，咁有冇啲黑人 rapper 會係覺得
受到冒犯？
係啊。
我覺得係有可能嘅，但係咧。當時 Debbie Harry 因為佢 network 實在太廣啦，佢識好多黑人，所以咧佢就冇出現，係啦，所以反而冇出現好似 Sylvia Robinson 嗰種咁樣嘅俾人告上法庭或者俾人揼嘅嗰種咁嘅情況。
You say one for the trouble, two for the time. Come on, girls, let's rock that.
Fat Five Freddy told me everybody slide. DJ spinning, I said my. Flash is back, flash is back. Flash is fast, Flash is cool, Francois c'est pas, Flash ain't no dude.
You say one for the trouble, two for the time. Come on, girls, let's rock that.
咁我跟住落嚟就簡單介紹一下歐洲嘅 rap 咯。咁我諗大家都想知道，即係呢個 rap 究竟係點樣開始呢個傳播到全世界啦嚇。其實都係反映 disco 文化多於 hip hop 文化嘅呢個傳播嘅。係。因為咧相比起呢一個嘅 Rapper's Delight 同埋 Christmas rapping 咧，其實咧呢個歐洲嘅 rap 咧，第一咧就係佢唔反映呢一個hip hop 文化裏邊嘅一啲，譬如話 break dancing 啊，譬如話 graffiti 啊呢啲咁樣嘅元素啦。但係佢好反映嘅就係咩？就係歐洲當時咧喺80年代初嘅一啲好社會批判性嘅東西啦。咁啊，譬如話咧喺82年嗰陣時，奧地利嘅第一首 rap 咧就係 Falco 嘅推出呢首《警官》呢首歌。咁啊，佢有一句説話就係 Alles klar Herr Kommissar， 意思就係話咩？阿 Sir 得未啊？
Alles klar, Herr Kommissar. Hey, wanna buy some stuff, man, huh? Did you ever rap that thing, Jack? So rap it to the beat. Wir treffen Chill und Joe und dessen Bruder Hip und auch den Rest der coolen Gang. Sie rappen hin, sie rappen her, dazwischen kratzen's abgewendet. Dieser Fall ist klar, lieber Herr Kommissar, auch wenn Sie anderer Meinung sind. Den Schnee, auf dem wir alle talwärts fahren, kennt heute jedes Kind. Jetzt das Kinderlied. Oh, oh, oh. Schau, schau, der Kommissar geht um. Oh, oh, oh. Er hat die Kraft und wir sind gerne und dumm. Und dieser Frust macht uns stumm. Draht ihn nicht um. Oh, oh, oh. Schau, schau, der Kommissar geht um. Oh, oh, oh. Wenn er dir anspricht und du weißt warum, sag ihm, dein Leben bringt dich um. Alles klar, Herr Kommissar. Tja, 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 tja,
就係德國嘅呢個 Nina Hagen 咧喺83年推出咗呢一首叫 New York New York 嘅咧，咁就係對紐約夜生活嘅一個致敬嚟嘅。咁佢嘅列舉咧就係眾多呢個 disco 嘅名，譬如話 AM/PM 啊、Pyramid 啊、Roxy 啊、Mud Club 啊、Danceteria 等等嘅。
Biggie in the nächste Disco. Eine Disco nach der anderen Disco. Und wackel im Takt, so fuck you rock die da. AM/PM, Pyramid, Roxy, Mud Club, Danceteria. Der neueste Nightclub macht auf heute Nacht. Der neueste Nightclub macht auf heute Nacht. Der neueste Nightclub macht auf heute Nacht. New York.
咁同呢一個相反嘅咧，就係呢個法國嘅 rap 嘅呢一種咁樣嘅左派嘅情懷咯。咁佢係有一種好深刻嘅呢個社會現實主義同埋一個控訴嘅情緒嘅。咁Chagrin d'Amour喺81年推出嘅法國第一張嘅 rap 嘅唱片咧，歌詞咧其實係早喺70年代已經寫成㗎啦，係講巴黎嘅夜生活啊、酗酒啊、呢個娼妓啊等等嘅。但係咧呢個填詞人咧 Philippe Bourgain 咧喺想盡辦法嘅情況底下，都呢個將唔到歌詞咧，佢都落去適當嘅呢個音樂上高嘅。結果最後就利用咗 rap 嘅形式嚟推出咗呢首歌嘅，咁一試就成功咗啦嚇。咁呢一個嘅歌詞咧就講一個嫖客同埋一個性工作者咧，都喺半夜失眠嘅情況底下咧，喺飲酒嘅時候打碎咗屋企最後一隻杯。咁並且係由呢度開始講起嘅。咁個嫖客第二朝俾人問到啦嚇，你記唔記得發生咩事啊？咁樣個嫖客就話：我乜都唔記得。
其實呢一首歌咧，仲有一個好重要嘅地方，就係提到 Bois de Boulogne 呢個咁嘅公園啦。咁呢個公園個名咧，譯中文嘅話就布洛列森林。咁呢個公園其實係一個性工作者嘅大本營，咁裏邊遍佈帳幕啦，同埋好多殘嘅。咁呢一句説話咧，其實嚟自咧呢個存在主義哲學家沙特嘅另一句説話。上集我哋講到咧，1956年蘇聯共產黨舉行20大嘅時候咧，就批判斯大林時期嘅錯誤。咁當時咧深信共產主義嘅沙特咧就講咗一句，就話咧呢個峰會咧係令到 Billancourt 咧陷入咗絕望嘅。咁呢句説話意思就係咩咧？就係 Billancourt 咧其實咧係布朗格寧嘅一個巴黎最大嘅汽車廠雷諾嘅所在地，亦都係法共嘅呢個工人階級嘅大本營。咁呢個20大咧批判斯大林咧，揭發共產主義幾十年嚟嘅錯誤咧，就會令到咧勞工運動陷入咗絕望同迷惘嘅。所以單係呢一句咧，都能夠讓呢個布洛列森林咧陷入絕望咧，以及 MV 嘅新浪潮電影嘅拍法咧，就能夠表達呢一首歌嘅創作者嘅左派政治嘅情懷。
7h du mat, l'hôtel. Je paie, j'abrège, je fouille mes poches. Je sais, c'est moche. Son sourire rouge, son corps qui bouge, elle fait glisser son cœur croisé sur sa peau bronzée. T'as les bas nylons qui filent sur le tendon, tes ongles m'accrochent. Tu viens chérie, le lit qui craque et les volets claquent. Seule dans le lit, dans ses draps bleus froissés, sur sa peau lisse, mes doigts glacés. Elle prend la pause, pense à autre chose. Ses yeux miroirs envoient mon regard. Des anges pressés dans ce bloc glacé me disent c'est l'heure. Je leur dis quelle heure.
Et vous vous souvenez vraiment pas de ce qui s'est passé?
Non, vraiment pas.
Chacun fait ce qui lui plaît.
Sous mes pieds, il y a la terre.
Sous tes pieds, il y a l'enfer. Chacun fait ce qui lui plaît.
Mon Dieu, je peux même pas jouir.
Tant pis pour toi, il faut dormir. Alors je me sauve dans le matin gris. C'est peine qu'un jour et pas de taxi. Les chats qui se tapent le petit ronron. Les éminents, ces petits bateaux. Pour de l'âge peur, je me sens pas belle. Les bigoudis sont plus emplis. Mon studio, j'aspirateur. La vidéo me fait un peu peur.
Madame Pipi a des ennuis. Monsieur Papa se fait des tracas. Dans les logis, les mal lotis. Bébé fait nuit, ça bouillit.
8h du mat, j'ai des frissons. Je claque des dents et j'y monte le son. Sur le lit de mes draps bleus passés. Ces insoumis sont mi-cassés. Je perds la tête, mes cigarettes sont toutes fumées dans le cendrier. Espèce de Kleenex et de bouteilles vides. Je suis toute seule. Dans Boulogne, c'est désespère. Je crois remplir un dernier verre. Clac, fais le verre en tombant sur les loges. Je coupe la mer en massant les morceaux.
咁另一首歌咧係嚟自 Elegance， 係叫做放假我忘記一切嘅，咁啊就係講一個勞動異化嘅問題。
呢個係
咁咧就係講呢個工作壓力咧壓到我喘不過氣來嗰陣時咧，咁啊呢個3個嘅主角啦，一個車房仔啦，一個快餐店嘅廚師啦，咁啊另外一個就電腦系統嘅主管啦，咁啊只能夠想像一次咧，佢哋不可能發生亦都不可能負擔嘅一次嘅喺遊艇上高嘅咁樣嘅海邊嘅度假啦。
J'ai la montre arrêtée, je sais même pas l'heure qu'il est. Le téléphone a sonné, je me suis pas réveillé. Direction salle de bain, je me fais couler un bain. Regardant le miroir, pas beau à voir, en retard sur l'horaire. Plus besoin de se presser, radio libre allumée, stop, pas de publicité. Une chanson bien connue, c'est le tube de l'été. Me fait flipper de la tête aux pieds. Je commence à ranger car ce soir terminé. Je serai sur la route avec des futés. Je suis pas seul à rêver du ciel des palmiers et des jours sans problème. C'est la vie que j'aime.
Rien à faire du tout, je m'envoie en l'air, ça c'est super folie légère. Vacances, j'oublie tout, rien à faire du tout, je m'envoie en l'air, ça c'est super folie légère, c'est fou.
Je sais même pas l'heure qu'il est, le téléphone a sonné, je me suis pas réveillé. Direction salle de bain, je fais couler mon bain, je regarde mon miroir. Pas beau à voir, je commence à ranger car ce soir terminé. Je serai sur la route avec bison futé. Je suis pas seul à rêver du ciel bleu des palmiers et des jours sans problème. C'est la vie que j'aime, pas besoin de penser, on peut pas résister. Restaurant, boîte de nuit, tout ce qu'on a envie. On peut manger à minuit et se coucher à midi. Plus de temps, plus d'horaire, les vacances c'est super.
Ça c'est super folie légère. Vacances, j'oublie tout, plus rien à faire du tout. Je m'envoie en l'air, ça c'est super folie légère, c'est fou.
我想問咧，就係你，譬如我哋今集呢一度咧，你 show 咗3首法國嘅 rap 啦，係咪因為喺法國佢哋可能 develop 得比較好啊？定係你純粹中意法國文化，或者你中意 French 嘅 rap？
因為嗱，其實上一集咧，我哋講過英國最早嘅 rap 嘅，咁就係一個係諷刺 BBC 嘅一個音樂人嘅嗰首 Wicked Rap 啦。咁啊，我跟住就去揾究竟法國最早嘅 rap 係幾時咧？咁樣，因為竟然就係揾到2首呢個咁有社會經濟嘅特性嘅一首咁樣嘅 rap， 我覺得都 include 入嚟都幾有特色啦嚇。咁亦都可以反映就係話，其實唔係淨係話喺 South Bronx 嗰度。先至開始有呢一個咁樣嘅社會經濟嘅政治嘅 rap 嘅 rap 呢種咁嘅形式，一去到歐洲嗰陣時，一着陸嗰陣時，基本上已經係好社會經濟同埋政治嘅批判性好強嘅。咁呢一點，我覺得好值得講嘅。咁好啦，咁講翻 rap 啦 ，rap 咧就還 rap 啦 ，hip hop 還 hip hop 啦。咁1981年開始咧。紐約嘅 rap 咧，亦都開始係呢一個進行一個社會經濟批判嘅一個咁樣嘅傾向。反而同步遲啲嘅。我覺得係同步嘅，因為我哋唔知道7980年嗰陣時有冇一啲人係私底下喺 MC Party 嗰陣時 rap 一啲咁嘅社會經濟嘅東西，但係咧你要記得嗰陣時。我頭先講過一個問題就係好多人 rap 嘅時候係冇 storyline， 係唔知自己 rap 緊啲咩嘅，或者淨係知道係我 rap 我好勁，我溝女好勁，我今日我溝到條女，佢聽朝都唔想走嗰啲咁樣嘅嘢。所以我好勁，係啦。咁但係咧，佢好勁，佢好勁，佢好勁，佢哋兩個好勁，係啦。咁但係咧，喺81年開始咧，就已經有呢個社會經濟方面嘅一個呢個 rap 嘅傾向咯喎。咁譬如呢一首咧係嚟自 嗰個 rapper 就係叫做 South Bronx 啦嚇，咁啊佢係講除咗治安問題之外，亦都講咧美好公司將呢個製造業嘅呢個職位咧轉移到海外啊，同埋對外國石油嘅依賴等等呢啲咁大社會經濟嘅問題嘅。
I work hard every day just to make ends meet. It's getting so bad, I'm afraid to walk the streets. Folks walking and squawking, cause they can't find a job. If they can't find work, they're gonna hustle and rob. Check it out, y'all. Most things with rise been made across the sea. And that means fewer jobs for you and for me. It really blows my mind, it makes my blood boil. How much they rip us off with their foreign oil. Who's gonna take the weight? Who's gonna take the blame? The way things are going, it's a crying shame. I'm cracking, but I'm backing in my rap of grief. If things don't get better, we'll all be on relief. So party hardy, y'all. Live life, y'all. Live life for today. Hang on in there, relief is on the way. Check it out, y'all. Party, party, party. Chicka boom, chicka bang, chicka yowzy wowzy, rock on with your bad self. Party, party, party. To the boom, huh.
嗱，咁我哋而家講翻 South Bronx 啊，因為我哋喺外邊兜咗個大圈啦嚇，又去咗呢一個呢個歐洲咁樣，又翻嚟講翻 South Bronx。咁我哋跟住嚟睇嘅呢個 MV 就係喺 South Bronx 嘅廢墟前面咧去拍嘅。咁基本上咧就係Grandmaster Flash 咧就同埋5個嘅 MC 啦嚇，叫做 Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five 嘅。Grandmaster Flash 同5個憤怒的人啦嚇。Furious Five。同埋點解 rap 都係有 fury 嘅？係啦，因為呢一首歌其實 rap 就唔一定有 fury， 因為早期嗰陣時 rap 好多，頭先所講啦，好多講我自己溝到嘅啫嘛。但係咧，去到 Grandmaster Flash 嗰陣時咧，佢就想去喺 Silver Robinson 嘅推動底下咧，佢就想講一啲咧係社會經濟嘅問題。咁咧就喺1982年嗰陣時就推出咗呢一首咧，就係呢一個被普遍認為咧係最有呢一個早期嘅呢一個影響力嘅一首咁樣嘅社會政治嘅 rap， 就叫做 The Message 訊息。The Message。
They pushed that girl in front of the train, took her to the doctor, sewed her arm on again, stabbed that man right in his heart. Gave him a transplant for a brand new start. I can't walk through the park cause it's crazy after dark. Keep my hand on my gun cause they got me on the run. I feel like an outlaw, broke my last glass jaw. Hear them say you want some more, living on a seesaw. Don't push me cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. Say what? It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
A child is born with no state of mind, blind to the ways of mankind. God is smiling on you, but he's frowning too, because only God knows what you'll go through. You'll grow in the ghetto, living second rate, and your eyes will sing a song of deep hate. The places you play and where you stay looks like one great big alleyway. You'll admire all the number book takers, thugs, pimps, and pushers, and the big money makers, driving big cars, spending 20s and 10s, and you wanna grow up to be just like them. Smugglers, scramblers, burglars, gamblers, pickpocket peddlers, even panhandlers. You say I'm cool, I'm no fool, but then you wind up dropping out of high school. Now you're unemployed, all non-void, walking around like your pretty boy Floyd. Turned stick-up kid, but look what you done did. Got sent up for an 8-year bid. Now your manhood is took and you're a make tag. Spend the next 2 years as an undercover fag, being used and abused to serve like hell. Till one day you was found hung dead in a cell. It was plain to see that your life was lost. You was cold and your body swung back and forth, but now your eyes sing the sad, sad song of how you live so fast and die so young. So don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge.
I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under. It's like a jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under.
Yo, Mel, you see that girl, man?
Yeah, man.
Yo, that sound like Cowboy, man. Yo, what's up, money?
Yo.
Hey, where's Cleo and Raheem, man?
They upstairs cooling out.
So what's up for the night, y'all?
Yo, we can go down to the fever, man.
Check out Junebug, man. Hey, yo, you know that girl Betty? Yeah, man. Her mom got robbed, man.
What?
Yeah, she got hurt.
What just happened? Free, don't nobody move nothing. Y'all know what this is. Get him up. Get him up.
Yo, man, we down with Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five.
What is that, a gang?
No,
Shut up. I don't want to hear your mouth. Shut up.
So what's the problem?
You the problem. You the problem. Yo, you ain't got to get in the car. Get in the car. Get in the gas. Get in the car.
Why is you doing
頭先嗰個 MV 去到最後尾咧 ，Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five 就俾一班警察啦，就擁咗上警車，全車就拉走咗咁樣嘅。但係喺83年嘅呢一場嘅現場表演嗰度咧 ，Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five 咧就竟然係痛毆嗰個警察嘅喎。
Please, double nothing. You know what this is. Wait a minute, get him up. That ain't no cop. You have this man. I got a ticket right here for all of you. Wait. Wasting our time, wasting the people's time. What's wrong with you? You ain't no cop. You ain't nothing. You ain't nothing. Hold this man here. Grab him, y'all. Grab him. Look, he ain't no cop. He's just stupid. And he's bald-headed. And he's ugly. Look at him. Now get on out of here, stupid, bald-headed, ugly so-and-so. You get on out of here. Don't you never come back.
好啦，亦都喺83年咧，因為 Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five 咧就同呢一個Sylvia Robinson 繼續合作啦嚇，咁咧就呢一個製作咗一首咧係反對毒品嘅一首 rap， 咁呢一個咧係非常之反映當時嘅毒品泛濫嘅問題啦。亦都揾咗反對毒品，好少歌喎，好少歌係因為好老土啊嘛，老土到咩程度？老土到咧就係咧佢哋喺表演完呢首歌之後咧，喺後台係繼續懟粉嘅。
係咪有人 commission 佢呢首歌啊？但係佢點解要做呢首歌？
點解要做呢首歌咧？真係唔明喎。
係有一個好簡單嘅答案。原本首歌根本係用嚟咧係 celebrate 呢個 cocaine 嘅 lifestyle。所以根本就唔係用嚟反對毒品嘅，係出街之前有人話咧唔可以咁樣出街嘅喎，咁就改咗啦。係啊，咁呢一首歌嘅呢一個 bassline 咧就係嚟自另外一個嘅 New York 嘅叫做 No Wave 嘅樂隊啦嚇，唔係嗰個樂隊自己叫做 No Wave， 而係嗰個音樂嘅種類叫做 No Wave， 即係大家知道有 New Wave 啦，大家知道。有punk 啦，咁喺兩者之間咧，當時有一班人想整一啲咧似 disco 又唔係 disco 嘅東西，咁就叫做 no wave 嘅。咁
咩為止似 disco 唔係 disco？
即係 bass 係咁重複，但係咧你係跳唔到舞嘅，係啦。咁然之後咧，佢哋呢一個呢首歌咧就係嚟自呢一個Liquid 嘅嗰首叫 Tavern。嘅Cavern 嘅嗰首歌啦嚇，咁Cavern 咧呢一首歌嘅嗰個 bassline 咧就係攞咗嚟做呢個 White Lines 嘅呢個 bassline 咁樣。 最後我想提一提咧，就係呢一個 Terry Lewis and Wildflower 喺83年嘅呢一首並不是廣為人知嘅一首 rap 啦。咁一開頭嗰陣時係一個女人尖叫啦，大家估到咩事啦？咁去到最後尾就係馬丁路德金嗰陣時嘅一個60年代嘅演說嚟嘅。咁講嘅大概咧就係呢一個梁啟超，如果大家讀過中學嗰陣時記得呢篇文啦，梁啟超一篇叫做呢一個敬業與熬業啦，即係講話你做大總統嘅做緊大總統嘅事情啦，你做車夫做車夫嘅事情啦。咁基本上叫人咧就係叫黑人咧嚇，你係掃街嘅話咧，你就掃到咧好似呢一個貝多芬咧係譜寫樂章一樣，你要掃到咧好似畫家畫畫一樣咁樣嘅。你要敬業熬業咁樣先至得到人哋嘅尊敬嘅咁樣。咁咧，我哋今日咧就只係能夠講到83年呢一度，因為 hip hop 嘅故事實在太長。咁我哋原本今次講到90年左右啦，但係我諗
古機都未開始講。
係啊，我哋連呢個 TR-808開始應用喺呢一個嘅係啦。咁咧就去到83年呢一個位置咧 ，rap 咧亦仍然係一個啱開始具有社會經濟政治批判性質嘅一個咁嘅東西，仍然係用緊 live band 嘅。咁但係咧之後嘅發展咧，我哋打算咧下一集或者再下一集有機會嘅話，再同大家一齊講。多謝大家，拜拜。
Ralph Waldo Emerson said in a lecture back in 1871, if a man can write a better book, or preach a better sermon, or make a better mousetrap than his neighbor, even if he builds his house in the wood, the world will make a beaten path to his door. This will become increasingly true. It means that we're going to have to work hard. We're going to have to burn the midnight oil sometime. We're going to have to take advantage of new opportunities. We must set out to do our life's work so well that nobody will do it better. We must set out to do a good job. We must not seek merely to do a good Negro job. If you were setting out to be merely a good Negro doctor, or a good Negro lawyer, a good Negro teacher, a good Negro preacher, or a good Negro skilled laborer, a good Negro barber, a good Negro beautician, you have already flunked your matriculation exam for entrance into the University of Integration. And we must get ready. We must set out to do a good job, and to do that job so well that the living, the dead, or the unborn couldn't do it better. I said so often, if it falls your lot to be a street sweeper, go on out and sweep streets like Michelangelo carved marble, sweep streets like Raphael painted pictures, sweep streets like Beethoven composed music, and like Shakespeare wrote portraits. Sweep streets so well that all the host of heaven and earth will have to pause and say, here lives a great street sweeper who swept his job well. This is it. Can't be a pine on the top of the hill, be a scrub in the valley, but be the best little scrub on the side of the rill. Be a bush if you can't be a tree. If you can't be a highway, just be a trail. If you can't be the sun, be a star. For it isn't by size that you win or you fail. Be the best of whatever you are.